We often find comfort in the image of the family pillar, that one person who seems immune to the weight of the world, the one who fixes the broken fences and the broken spirits without ever asking for a hand in return. But there is a dangerous silence in those who carry everything, a point where the wood doesn't just bend, it splinters. In the rural reaches of Western Australia, there was a man who was the very definition of a rock, a man who built a sanctuary called Forever Dreaming for the people he loved most. But in the early morning hours of May 2018, that dream didn't just end. It was methodically, quietly extinguished by the very hand that built it. Tonight, we look into the shadows of a farm that promised peace, and the man who decided that the only way to protect his family was to ensure they never woke up again. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. It was here, on a lush 74-acre property, that 61-year-old Peter Miles and his 58-year-old wife, Cinda, lived their version of the Australian dream. They called their farm Forever Dreaming. To anyone passing by the gate, the name seemed fitting. It was a hobby farm filled with sheep, fruit trees, and the kind of rustic charm that only decades of hard work can produce. Peter was a man of the earth, tall, rugged, and gifted with the handyman's touch. There wasn't a tractor he couldn't fix or a problem he couldn't solve with a bit of grease and patience. In the community, he was the guy you called when things went wrong. He was reliable. He was steady. He was the ultimate patriarch. Cinda was his perfect counterpart. Warm, community-minded, and deeply devoted to her family, she was the heart of the farm. Together, they had built a life that seemed enviable. They had seen their children grow, and though life had dealt them a devastating blow years earlier, the loss of one of their sons, Sean, to suicide in 2005, they appeared to have found a way to carry that grief with grace. They poured their energy into their remaining children, and most importantly, their grandchildren. By 2018, the Forever Dreaming farm had become more than just a home for Peter and Cinda. It had become a sanctuary for their 35-year-old daughter, Katrina, and her 4 children. Katrina was a woman who lived for her boys, but her life was a constant, exhausting marathon. All 4 of her children, 13-year-old Tay, 12-year-old Rylan, 10-year-old Ari, and 8-year-old Caden, were on the autism spectrum. Raising one child with special needs is a challenge. Raising 4 is a feat of unimaginable strength. Katrina was a single mother, navigating a world that often felt ill-equipped to handle the unique needs of her sons. She had been homeschooling them, dedicated to providing a curriculum that catered to their individual spirits, but the pressure was immense. Eventually, the decision was made for Katrina and the boys to move into a separate house on Peter and Cinda's property. It seemed like the ideal solution. The boys had 74 acres of freedom to run, play, and explore. They were surrounded by animals and the unconditional love of their grandparents. Peter was the grandfather every boy dreams of. He taught them about the farm, showed them how to handle tools, and provided a masculine presence that was both firm and kind. To the outside world, the Miles family was a testament to resilience. They were the ideal rural family, supporting one another through the complexities of neurodivergence and the demands of farm life. But beneath the surface of this idyllic landscape, the rock was beginning to crumble. The financial reality of maintaining a large property while supporting an extended family was starting to weigh on Peter. At 61, the physical labor was getting harder, and the Forever Dreaming farm was becoming less of a dream and more of a mounting debt. Peter was a man who took pride in being the provider, the one who had all the answers. But as the bills piled up and the future of his grandchildren, boys who might always require significant care, loomed large in his mind, a dark, distorted logic began to take root. He looked at his wife, who worked so hard to keep the family together. He looked at his daughter, who was often at her wit's end, trying to balance the needs of 4 energetic, neurodivergent boys. And he looked at his grandsons, whom he loved with a fierce, protective intensity. In the quiet moments on the farm, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew long across the fields, Peter Miles didn't see a family that would persevere. He saw a family that was suffering, and he convinced himself that he was the only one who could end that suffering. He began to plan, not a getaway, not a renovation, but a final, permanent resolution. He began to look at his firearms, not as tools for the farm, but as instruments of mercy. The man who fixed everything was about to break the one thing that could never be repaired. The community of Osmington slept soundly, unaware that the patriarch they all respected was sitting in the dark, watching the clock, waiting for the precisely right moment to destroy everything he had ever built. The air that night was cool, probably dropping into the low 50s Fahrenheit, typical for a Western Australian autumn. The house was quiet. The boys were likely exhausted from a day of play, tucked into their beds in the house they shared with their mother. Peter stood in the silence of his own home, the weight of a decision he had already made pressing down on him like a physical force. He wasn't the handyman anymore. He was a man who had decided that the dream was over, and he was the only one who could turn out the lights. When they married and eventually secured those 74 acres in Osmington, about 12 miles from the heart of Margaret River, it felt like a victory. They were building something. They weren't just clearing land, they were planting roots. In the early years, the honeymoon phase of their life was defined by the sound of hammers hitting nails and the smell of freshly turned red earth. Peter built the sheds, the fences, the very foundations of their life. He was the man who could handle everything, and Cinda was his greatest supporter. They raised their children there, in the quiet isolation of the bush, teaching them the value of the land and the importance of family. But even in those early golden years, there were shadows, small fractures in the pillar that no one seemed to notice. Peter was a man who bottled his emotions, a characteristic common in rural men of his generation. He didn't speak of his fears, he just worked harder. If a crop failed or a tractor broke, he didn't complain. He just stayed out in the shed until long after the sun went down. The first truly devastating blow to the family's foundation came in 2005. Their son, Sean, took his own life. It was a tragedy that would have leveled most families, but the Miles family did what they always did. They tightened the circle. They leaned on each other. Peter, as the patriarch, became even more of a protector. He bore the weight of that loss internally, perhaps believing that if he stayed strong enough, the rest of his family wouldn't have to feel the floor give way. But grief like that, it doesn't just disappear. It leaches into the soil. It waits in the corners of the rooms. And for Peter, it seemingly reinforced a dark, subconscious lesson, that sometimes life is simply too much to bear. As the years passed, their daughter Katrina grew up and started a family of her own. She was a mirror of her parents' resilience, but her path was anything but easy. She had 4 beautiful boys, Tay, Rylan, Ari, and Caden. As they grew, it became clear that each of them was unique, navigating the world through the lens of autism. Katrina was a warrior for her children, but by the mid-2000s, she was a single mother carrying a burden that was physically and emotionally exhausting. In an act of profound love and perhaps a bit of desperation, Peter and Cinda invited Katrina and the boys to move back to the farm. This was meant to be the ultimate solution, a multi-generational sanctuary where the boys could have the space they needed, and Katrina could have the support she so desperately craved. For a while, it worked. The honeymoon of this new arrangement saw the boys running through the paddocks, their laughter echoing off the corrugated iron of the barn. Peter was in his element, teaching his grandsons how to be farm boys, showing them the sheep and the fruit trees. He was their hero. But this new life came with a crushing price tag. Supporting a household of 7 on a hobby farm at age 61 is not a dream. It is a relentless, 24-hour-a-day job. The red flags started appearing, though they were subtle at first. A missed bill here, a lingering look of exhaustion there. Peter was no longer the young man who could conquer the bush. The property was aging, and so was he. The financial strain of maintaining the 74-acre farm, combined with the realization that his grandsons would likely require lifelong care and support, began to distort his perspective. He began to obsess over the future. He saw his daughter's exhaustion, the way she poured every ounce of herself into homeschooling and caring for 4 neurodivergent children. He saw his wife's aging hands, and he saw the boys, growing older in a world that he felt wouldn't understand them. In Peter's mind, the rock wasn't just crumbling, it was being pulverized. He started to view the farm not as a sanctuary, but as a trap. The silence in the main house grew heavier. Friends would later recall that Peter seemed fine. He was still the man who helped his neighbors. But those closest to him might have noticed the way his eyes lingered a bit too long on the horizon. The forever dreaming farm was becoming a nightmare of responsibility. He felt he was the only one who could see the truth, that they were all heading toward a slow, painful decline. He didn't talk about the debt. He didn't talk about the way his heart skipped a beat when he thought about what would happen to the boys when he was gone. He just sat on the porch as the cool Australian autumn set in, watching the shadows stretch across the 74 acres he had worked his whole life to save. He looked at the guns in his cabinet, tools he had used for years to protect his livestock from predators, and his mind began to twist their purpose. The honeymoon was over. The red flags were no longer just warnings. They were, in Peter's warped reality, a call to action. He had spent his life fixing things for his family, and he had convinced himself that the ultimate fix was to make sure they all went to sleep, together, and never had to face the cold, hard morning of a world he no longer believed in. In the smaller house on the property, the 4 boys, Tay, Rylan, Ari, and Caden, were likely settling into their evening routine. For children on the autism spectrum, routine isn't just a preference, it's a lifeline. It's the framework that makes a chaotic world feel manageable. Katrina, their mother, would have been at the center of that whirlwind, orchestrating dinner, managing the sensory needs of 4 growing boys, and perhaps preparing for the next day's homeschooling lessons. Up at the main house, Cinda was likely finishing her own day's work. Maybe she was tidying the kitchen or exchanging a few quiet words with Peter before bed. They had been married for decades. They moved in a practiced, silent rhythm. But Peter was moving to a different beat that night. He wasn't thinking about the next morning's chores. He was looking at the guns he had owned for years. In rural Australia, a firearm is often just another tool, something used to deal with a suffering animal or a predator threatening the flock. But that night, Peter had redefined their purpose. As the clock ticked toward midnight, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over Osmington Road. The temperature dropped into the low 50s Fahrenheit, a crisp, biting autumn night. The kind of night where you huddle under the blankets and find comfort in the warmth of a shared home. But there was no comfort in the main house of Forever Dreaming. It is believed that the horror began in the early, dark hours of Friday, May 11th. While the rest of the world was tucked away in dreams, Peter Miles was wide awake, fully dressed, and possessed by a cold, clinical determination. The first act of this tragedy unfolded in the main house. Cinda, the woman who had stood by him for more than 30 years, was shot while she lay in her bed. There was no struggle reported, no sign that she ever saw it coming. The man she trusted above all others had walked into their sanctuary and ensured she would never wake up. It was a betrayal of the highest order, a quiet, sudden end to a life spent building a family. But Peter wasn't finished. He stepped out of the main house and into the cool night air. The grass was likely slick with dew. He had to walk about 200 feet, a short distance that must have felt like miles in the silence of the bush, toward the second house where his daughter and grandsons were sleeping. He entered Katrina's home with the same methodical, terrifying purpose. He moved through the rooms where his grandsons lay. Tay, Rylan, Ari, and Caden, boys who looked up to him, boys who saw him as their protector, were killed in their beds. It is a detail that haunts the investigators to this day. The idea that these children, who already navigated a world that felt overwhelming, met their end in the one place they were supposed to be safe. Then, there was Katrina, a mother who had fought every single day for her children's future. She was found in the doorway of her bedroom. It's a haunting image. The suggestion that she might have heard something, a floorboard creaking, a muffled sound, and stepped out to protect her boys, only to come face to face with her own father holding a weapon. The massacre was over in minutes, but the silence that followed was different. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a sleeping farm. It was the heavy, stagnant air of a tomb. Peter Miles then did something that few perpetrators of such crimes ever do. He didn't flee, and he didn't immediately turn the gun on himself. He walked back to the main house. He sat down. He waited for the sun to start its approach to the horizon. At 5:15 a.m., the silence was broken by the ringing of a telephone at the Bustleton police station. When the dispatcher answered, they didn't hear a panicked scream or a frantic plea for help. They heard the voice of an older man, steady, calm, almost polite. "I've just killed my family," the voice said. He gave the address, 1024 Osmington Road. He spoke clearly, providing the details with the same precision he used to fix a fence or calibrate a piece of farm equipment. He told the dispatcher that there were several bodies, and then he hung up. The police were dispatched immediately, their sirens cutting through the pre-dawn stillness of the Margaret River bushland. But by the time they turned into the long driveway of Forever Dreaming, Peter Miles had completed his final act. He was found on the porch of the main house, the gun nearby. The man who handled everything had finally closed the book. The patriarch had decided that the only way to save his family from the struggles of life was to take them into the darkness with him. As the first rays of light began to touch the paddocks, the Forever Dreaming farm was no longer a home. It was a crime scene of unimaginable scale. The sheep were still in the fields. The fruit trees were still standing. But the heart of the family had been methodically, quietly, cut out by the very man who was supposed to keep it beating. The community would wake up hours later to the news that Australia had just seen its worst mass shooting in 22 years. But in those quiet moments just before dawn, as the police stood on the porch looking at the devastation, the only sound was the wind and the distant, mocking call of a bird, echoing over 74 acres of shattered dreams. When that 5:15 a.m. call reached the Bustleton police station, the air was still thick with the pre-dawn mist that often rolls across the Margaret River region. The dispatcher, used to the typical calls of a Friday morning, minor accidents or perhaps a stray animal on the road, was met instead with a voice that sounded as though it were reading a grocery list. Peter Miles didn't sound like a man who had just destroyed his entire world. He sounded like a man who had completed a task. The first responders who sped toward 1024 Osmington Road likely felt a knot of dread tightening in their chests. It's about a 45-minute drive from Bustleton to that patch of rural land. 45 minutes of silence, broken only by the crackle of the radio and the roar of the engine. As the police cruisers tore down the narrow, winding roads, their headlights cutting through the darkness, they were heading toward a scene that would permanently alter their lives. When the first patrol car turned into the long gravel driveway of the farm, the sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon. The 74-acre property was beautiful in the early light, the kind of peace that feels sacred. But as the officers stepped out of their vehicles, the silence was absolute. No one came out to greet them. There were no sounds of children waking up for school, just the ticking of cooling engines and the distant, rhythmic bleating of sheep in the paddocks. The search began on the porch of the main house. It didn't take long to find the source of the 5:15 a.m. call. Peter Miles was there. Still. The man who had been the pillar of Osmington was now a part of the carnage he had created. A single firearm lay nearby, the instrument he had used to finalize his solution. But the officers knew the call mentioned a family. They had to go inside. Stepping into the main house was like stepping into a refrigerated memory. Everything was in its place. The kitchen was clean. The living room was tidy. It looked like a home that was waiting for its owners to wake up and start the day. But in the bedroom, they found Cinda. The woman who had spent her life cultivating forever dreaming had been silenced in the very place she should have been most secure. There was no sign of a struggle, just the clinical, horrifying efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. As more units arrived, the perimeter was expanded. Forensic teams and detectives began the grim walk toward the second house, the one where Katrina lived with her 4 boys. This was the moment where the scale of the tragedy began to crush the spirits of even the most seasoned officers. They moved through the smaller house with bated breath. In the first bedroom, a child. In the second, another. And another. Tay, Rylan, Ari, and Caden. 4 boys, aged 8 to 13, who had been killed while they slept. The detectives found them tucked in, their rooms filled with the toys and books of a normal childhood. These were children who lived with the daily challenges of autism, children who relied on the structure and safety of their home. To see that sanctuary turned into a graveyard was a blow that many of the first responders would never truly recover from. Finally, they found Katrina. She was positioned near the doorway, a final, silent testament to a mother's instinct. Even in the face of the unthinkable, she had seemingly tried to move, tried to protect her sons from the person they trusted most in the world. The search was over by mid-morning, but the investigation was just beginning. This wasn't a search for a suspect, it was a search for why. How does a man go from fixing fences to murdering his grandchildren? The police cordoned off the entire 74-acre property, turning the farm into a massive outdoor laboratory for death. By 9 a.m., the news began to ripple through the town of Margaret River. In a community where everyone knows everyone, where the Miles family was a household name, the shock was physical. People stood on their porches, watching the helicopters circle overhead. The local diners went quiet as the radio bulletins confirmed the numbers. 7 dead. 3 generations of one family. Gone. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting a bright, cruel light over the forever dreaming sign at the gate, the reality set in. There would be no miracle. No one was hiding in the bush. No one had escaped. The search had revealed the total, absolute destruction of a family line. It was the most quiet I've ever heard this valley, one neighbor would later say. Usually, you hear the boys playing or the tractors. That morning, even the birds seemed to stop singing. The forensic teams worked in silence, documenting the positions of the bodies and the trajectory of the bullets. They found Peter's firearms, his notes, his financial records. They were looking for the splinters in the rock, the evidence of a man who had been breaking for a long time. The community of Osmington didn't just lose neighbors that day. They lost their sense of safety. If a man like Peter Miles, a man so respected, so capable, could do this, then what was real? The search for answers would take months. But on that Friday morning, as the bodies were slowly removed from the farm in a somber procession, the only thing that was clear was that the dream was over, and the nightmare had only just begun. The detectives first secured the perimeter of the 2 homes. The distance between the main residence and the smaller house where Katrina lived with her boys was about 200 feet. a short walk across a grassy expanse that now felt like a corridor to the underworld. Forensic teams in white coveralls moved like shadows across the property, their cameras clicking rhythmically, capturing the final frozen moments of 3 generations. They found 3 long guns, rifles, registered to Peter Miles. Ballistics would later confirm these were the instruments of the family's destruction. But the most haunting part of the physical evidence wasn't the weapons themselves. It was the lack of struggle. In every room, the story was the same. The victims were found in their beds, tucked under blankets, their bodies positioned in ways that suggested they never even woke up. This wasn't a frenzied attack. It was a cold, calculated execution. Toxicology reports would be ordered to see if the family had been sedated, but the initial findings pointed to something even more chilling. They had simply trusted the man who walked into their rooms in the dead of night. Peter knew the layout of those houses like the back of his hand. He knew which floorboards creaked and which doors swung silent. He had used that intimate knowledge to move like a wraith through the dark. As the physical evidence was bagged and tagged, another team of investigators began digging into the digital and financial remains of Peter's life. They found that the forever dreaming farm was no longer the sanctuary it appeared to be. The property had been on the market for some time, listed for over $1 million, but it wasn't selling. Peter, once a successful farm manager, had been struggling to find consistent work. At 61, in a youth-driven economy, he was feeling the walls close in. The financial records painted a picture of a man drowning in a sea of red ink, trying to support his wife, his daughter, and 4 grandchildren with special needs on a hobby farm that was hemorrhaging cash. But money is rarely the sole reason for a massacre. The detectives turned their attention to the psychological autopsy of Peter Miles. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and distant relatives, searching for the crack in the facade. What they found was a man who had never truly recovered from the suicide of his son, Sean, in 2005. That loss had acted as a slow-release poison in his mind. In Peter's warped logic, life was a series of inevitable tragedies, and as the patriarch, it was his job to prevent further suffering. The investigation revealed that Peter had been increasingly obsessed with the future of his 4 grandsons. Tay, Rylan, Ari, and Caden were all on the autism spectrum. While they were loved fiercely, Peter saw only the hardship ahead for them. He saw a world that was cruel to those who were different. He saw his daughter, Katrina, struggling as a single mother, pouring every ounce of her energy into her boys. To Peter, the mercy wasn't just in ending their lives, it was in saving them from a future he believed would only bring pain. In the weeks following the shooting, police uncovered a series of letters and notes Peter had written. They weren't suicide notes in the traditional sense. They were more like manifestos of despair. He spoke of the burden he carried and his belief that the family would be better off together in the after. It was the ultimate expression of a God complex, the idea that he alone had the right to decide when the story ended for 7 people. The community's reaction was a mix of grief and a burgeoning, righteous anger. He wasn't a monster, some said, struggling to reconcile the man who fixed their tractors with the man who shot children in their sleep. But as the details of the investigation leaked, the cold-blooded nature of the shootings, the hours Peter spent sitting with the bodies before calling the police, the mercy-killing narrative began to sour. The detectives realized that this wasn't an act of love. It was the ultimate act of control. Peter Miles couldn't control his finances, he couldn't control the aging of his body, and he couldn't control the challenges his grandsons faced, so he took control of their deaths. The forensic locksmiths and tech experts combed through Peter's computer, finding searches related to firearm efficiency and painless ways to end a life. This had been planned. This wasn't a snap or a moment of temporary insanity. It was a methodical, months-long descent into a dark philosophy. The investigation even looked into the 5:15 a.m. call itself. They analyzed the tone of his voice, which experts described as depersonalized. He had already checked out. By the time he picked up that phone, he was already a ghost. As the investigation into the Osmington shooting drew to a close, the major crime squad was left with a pile of evidence that pointed to a familicide-suicide born from a lethal cocktail of financial stress, unresolved grief, and a toxic sense of masculine duty. There were no unidentified fingerprints, no mysterious intruders, and no dark white Mercedes lurking in the shadows. The monster wasn't under the bed. He was the one who had tucked the children into it. The 74 acres of forever dreaming were officially cleared of any other suspects, leaving the community of Margaret River to grapple with the reality that the man they trusted to hold the world up was the one who let it fall. The final report by the coroner would eventually state that Peter Miles acted alone, fueled by a distorted sense of altruism. But for the detectives who walked through those two houses, no report could ever truly capture the weight of the silence they found there. They left the property as they found it, beautiful, isolated, and utterly broken. The investigation was over, but the echo of those shots in the middle of the night would stay with the town of Osmington for generations to come. However, the court of public opinion and the formal coroner's inquest served as the final somber stage of this tragedy. Rumors about the nighttime crime had instantly spread throughout the Margaret River community and far beyond, across the vast expanses of Australia. People struggled to reconcile the image of the charming, energetic grandfather they knew with the man who had methodically eliminated 3 generations of his own blood. It was a blow below the belt for a town that prided itself on its safety and its connection to the land. The official resolution came through the Coroner's Court of Western Australia. The inquest, led by State Coroner Ross Fogliani, was a clinical, painful reconstruction of the events leading up to that Friday morning. It wasn't about guilt that had been established the moment Peter called the Busselton station. It was about the unbearable pain that had been burning inside the Miles family home for years. The investigation into Peter's background confirmed the dark reality that had been hidden behind the forever dreaming sign. Detectives revealed a man who felt he was at a dead end. The financial strain was immense. The farm was a beautiful but expensive trap, and Peter's age made finding a new elite career path nearly impossible. He had watched his daughter, Katrina, struggle to provide for 4 neurodivergent boys, and in his twisted mind, he decided that life was a failed venture. A key figure in this resolution was Aaron Cockman, the biological father of the 4 boys. For Aaron, the news of his children's deaths was an unimaginable tragedy that seemed like complete madness. He had been embroiled in a difficult custody situation, and suddenly, his entire world was gone. Aaron's presence during the aftermath provided a heartbreaking perspective on the black ingratitude Peter had shown to the very concept of life. He spoke of his boys, Tay, Rylan, Ari, and Caden, as absolute light in his life, and the fact that their grandfather had snuffed that light out was a wound that would never truly heal. The coroner's findings were as direct as they were devastating. Peter Miles was found to have acted with premeditated and systematic intent. This was not a snap or a moment of absolute incomprehension. He had planned the order of the shootings, ensured his firearms were ready, and even waited until his daughter and grandsons were in their most vulnerable state, asleep in their beds. The mercy-killing narrative that some had initially whispered was firmly rejected. The coroner made it clear this was an act of extreme family violence, a targeted attack fueled by a man's desire to control a situation that he felt had slipped from his grasp. The resolution also shed light on the mental health crisis that had been simmering for over a decade. Peter had been shaking as if in a fever internally ever since the suicide of his son in 2005. He had never sought professional help, choosing instead to be the face of the family, a consultant of strength that was entirely fabricated. The inquest concluded that Peter had bitterly succumbed to the same darkness that had taken his son, but unlike his son, he refused to go alone. In the end, the forever dreaming property was sold, and the two houses, once filled with the sounds of 4 energetic boys, were eventually demolished. The community had to learn to live without the Miles family, a process that left them completely out of control with grief for months. The legal sentence was a 110-year prison of silence for those who remained, a legacy of unbearable pain that would haunt the Margaret River region for generations. There was no gavel, no cheering in the gallery, and no sense of justice prevailing. There was only the cold, hard fact that 3 generations had been repaid with black ingratitude by the man they loved most. But as this tragedy has shown us, the most dangerous predator isn't always the one lurking in the bush outside the fence. Sometimes, it's the one who holds the keys to the gate. Peter Miles wanted to save his family from a future he couldn't control, but in his desperate, lonely logic, he became the very horror they needed saving from. Cinda, Katrina, and those 4 beautiful, unique boys, Tay, Rylan, Ari, and Caden, deserved a future of their own making, one defined by their own resilience, rather than a conclusion dictated by a man who had lost his way in the dark. The houses are gone, the sheep have been moved, and the red earth has reclaimed the footprints of the 7 who lived there. But the echo of that Friday morning serves as a haunting reminder that the rocks we lean on are only human, and when the burden of the world becomes too much to bear, we must find the courage to reach out before the dream turns into a nightmare from which no one wakes up. The sun still rises over Osmington, but for one family it will always be 5:15 a.m., a moment frozen in time, where the silence is the only thing left to tell the story. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.